You know, I had this whole idea of what we'd be talking about today. I was like 90% sure it was going to be that piano-playing cat video that's everywhere.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Pretty impressive, actually.
Totally. Like, give that cat an agent. But, nope, surprise. We're pivoting from feline virtuosos to, well, something a bit more grounded. We're circling back to the Trump tariffs.
That's right. It's time for, our somewhat regular check-in on the U.S.-China trade situation.
Yeah.
But there are definitely some new wrinkles this time.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Okay, let's get into it then. So, for you listening, here's the plan. We're going to unpack the very latest on the U.S.-China tariff front, see where things actually stand.
Mm-hmm.
We'll touch on some predictions floating around about China's economy. And this is where it gets, well, really complex. We're going to tackle this question. Is this all just about trade? Or is there maybe, possibly, a historical angle we need to consider?
Exactly. The information we've seen suggests it's potentially deeper than just your standard trade dispute. Lots of layers here.
All right, let's dive in. What's the absolute latest news on these tariffs? What's happening right now?
Okay, so the main thing is these ongoing trade discussions in Geneva. On the Chinese side, you've got Vice Premier He Lifeng, and also, this is quite interesting, Public Security Minister Wang Xiaohong. Yeah. The
security minister. That feels significant. Who's there for the U.S.?
The U.S. delegation includes Besneth and the U.S. Trade Representative. So, yeah, serious folks on both sides.
Definitely. So what are the sticking points? What are they really, hashing out?
Well, several big things. One condition that President Trump has mentioned sort of as a prerequisite for talks is the release of Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong media figure.
Wow. Okay, so tying a human rights issue directly, explicitly, to trade talks.
Yeah.
It's a bold line.
It is, and it kind of reflects what you hear from other U.S. officials, too, like Senator Rubio, who argue that human rights need to be part of the whole U.S.-China conversation, not separate.
Right, integrating it all, that definitely adds complexity. What else is the U.S. asking for?
Fentanyl is still a huge issue. The U.S. has given China a pretty detailed list of demands, basically specific actions they want taken.
Okay, lay them on us. What are the specifics?
They're asking for, first, a public condemnation of fentanyl stuff right on the front page of the People's Daily, China's main official paper.
The front page. That's quite a demand.
It is. They also want communication about this through high-level Communist Party channels, much tighter controls on specific precursor chemicals, the ones used to make fentanyl, and just generally deeper cooperation between U.S. and Chinese law enforcement.
Those are substantial asks, especially that public statement part. How's China taking these demands?
Well, not surprisingly, they've protested strongly. They seem to view these demands, especially about their own media and internal party stuff, as, well, arrogant and basically interfering in their internal business.
Yeah, sounds like they're definitely not on the same page there.
Yeah.
Any other ripples, like outside the direct U.S.-China talks?
Yeah, it's worth noting the EU, the European Union, is also voicing more concerns lately about trade imbalances with China and also what they call dumping, selling Chinese goods in Europe super cheap, maybe below cost, potentially hurting European companies.
So it's not just a U.S. thing. It's a broader trend of countries kind of reassessing trade with China.
Seems that way, yes. It adds context.
Okay, now going back to fentanyl, you mentioned China's strong reaction to the U.S. demands. What's their actual counter-argument? How do they see it?
Their main point is that these precursor chemicals, the ones the U.S. is focused on, have lots of legitimate uses. In industry, manufacturing, it's not like they only exist to make illegal drugs.
Okay, fair point. Lots of chemicals are dual use. But what about the U.S. argument that China isn't doing enough to stop these specific chemicals from getting diverted?
China says their export tax rebates are just general subsidies for their whole chemical sector, not specific handouts for drug materials. They really push back against the U.S. idea that any subsidy for these chemicals automatically means they're helping fentanyl flow.
So a real fundamental disagreement on how to interpret their own policies and the impact. Didn't they put out like a formal response too?
Yes, they did. They released a white paper that specifically argued against the findings of that U.S. Congressional Committee report on fentanyl.
Okay. Two very different stories being told about the fentanyl issue and who's responsible. Right, let's switch gears a bit. There was a pretty stark prediction about Chinese exports, wasn't there?
Yes, quite stark. One report laid out a scenario where, if the current tariffs stay as they are, Chinese exports to the U.S. could drop dramatically.
How dramatic are we talking? Give us the number.
The projection was a potential plummet of, get this, 77% this year.
77, wow. That just sounds potentially devastating for their economy. What would that actually mean for China internally?
Well, the potential consequences described are pretty severe. You're looking at possible major unemployment, especially in export-heavy industries, businesses going under, and maybe even, wider financial instability, a potential crisis.
Oof. Yeah, those are serious potential impacts. It really highlights how high the stakes are with these tariffs. Okay, so this leads us to that really complicated and honestly pretty charged question that some people are asking. Is it possible, is there any chance that China is sort of deliberately letting fentanyl flow into the U.S. as payback, like revenge for the Opium Wars? It sounds kind of conspiratorial, so let's tread carefully here.
It is, yeah. It's an incredibly complex and sensitive idea. It pulls in history, geopolitics, economics, public health. You really have to approach it carefully and look at the actual evidence, not just speculation.
Definitely. Okay, so for anyone listening who needs a quick refresher, can you just briefly outline the U.S. fentanyl crisis and then remind us about the Opium Wars and why they're such a big deal in China's history?
Sure. So the fentanyl crisis in the U.S., it's about this massive spike in overdose deaths. Fentanyl is incredibly potent. A tiny amount can kill. CDC data from, I think it was 2021, showed over 100,000 drug overdose deaths, and something like 70% involved fentanyl.
Devastating numbers.
Yeah. And a lot of the illicit fentanyl itself, or the chemicals needed to make it, originates in China. It often comes through Mexico, but the source of the precursors is frequently traced back to China.
Got it. Okay, and the Opium Wars, why do they still resonate so strongly?
The first Opium War was back in 1839 to 1842. Basically, Britain wanted to force China, the Qing dynasty then, to accept imported opium. China lost, had to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, and this is widely seen in China as the start of their century of humiliation.
The century of humiliation.
Yeah, a period where they feel they were exploited and weakened by Western powers. It's absolutely central to modern Chinese nationalism and how they view their history. So when some people in the West use this new Opium War analogy for fentanyl, well, it naturally sparks this question about historical revenge.
Right, the idea that maybe China sees this as like karmic justice or something, allowing fentanyl to harm the U.S. as payback for what happened with opium back then. Okay, so as you said, we need evidence. What arguments or pieces of information do people point to support this revenge theory?
Well, one major line of argument focuses on what they see as weak regulation of fentanyl-related exports from China. U.S. congressional reports, for example, have alleged that the Chinese government actually subsidizes companies making these precursors and that oversight is just too lax.
Subsidies, so actively helping companies that make this stuff.
That's the allegation in some reports, yes. And they point to the large amounts of these chemicals seized by the DEA originating from China as sort of proof that controls aren't working. Some analysts go further and suggest maybe this weak enforcement isn't accidental. Maybe it's intentional. Peter Schweitzer has written about alleged links between Chinese criminal groups, the triads, and Mexican cartels, suggesting potential official complicity.
That's a serious claim. Any other angles supporting this idea?
There's also the symbolic argument. Like we said, the Opium Wars, the century of humiliation. It's a deep wound. Some Western commentators suggest maybe some people in China view the fentanyl crisis hitting the U.S. as a kind of, historical balancing of the scales. People like Steve Yates have framed it as part of China's internal war against America.
Wow. So linking it directly to historical grievance and a sense of payback, what about, bigger picture geopolitics? Does that play in?
It does. Some argue this could fit into a strategy of unrestricted warfare, weakening the U.S. through non-military means. It aligns with the whole U.S.-China strategic competition narrative we see in trade, tech, everything else. And you even had President Trump calling the fentanyl issue a war and linking it to trade actions. So that kind of thinking exists at high levels in the U.S. too.
Okay. So there are definitely points people raise to suggest this might be more than just, chemicals and crime. But what about the arguments against this revenge mentality? What evidence contradicts it?
Well, probably the biggest thing is just the lack of direct, solid evidence. There's no known public document, no leaked official policy saying, yes, let's use fentanyl against the U.S.'s. Professor Gao Zhang, for instance, argues the U.S. is kind of politicizing the issue, trying to blame China for America's own drug problems. You see skepticism online, too, people saying it sounds like old conspiracy theories.
Right. Hard proof of intent is missing. What about China's own situation with drugs? Are they immune?
Not at all. That's another key point. China has its own drug problems, and fentanyl production and smuggling are a threat to their own social stability. And importantly, they have taken steps to increase control. Like in 2019, they scheduled all fentanyl-related substances.
So they made them illegal to produce without authorization.
Exactly. And President Xi himself committed to cracking down on fentanyl smuggling and boosting cooperation with the U.S. after that summit in 2023. Those actions don't really fit with a secret plan to flood the U.S., do they?
Doesn't seem like it. Are there other factors driving this whole thing besides potential government policy?
Oh, absolutely. Market forces are huge here.
Yeah.
The global fentanyl trade is driven by profit. China has this enormous chemical industry, and making these precursors is relatively cheap with high potential profits, which naturally attracts criminal networks.
Simple economics almost.
To a large extent, yeah. And on the demand side, you have the U.S. The opioid crisis that really took off in the 90s created this huge demand for potent painkillers. Many argue that overprescription by doctors in the pharmaceutical industry here in the U.S. is a major root cause of the addiction problem that fentanyl now feeds.
So supply from China's chemical industry, meeting demand, rooted in the U.S. healthcare system and addiction issues, plus criminal networks exploiting it all.
Exactly. And one more point. The historical analogy itself, the Opium Wars comparison, has limits. Back then, the British government and the East India Company were directly pushing opium. Today, it's mostly private companies, criminal groups. The Chinese government's role, while debated regarding regulation, isn't as direct as Britain's was. And while Chinese nationalism definitely uses the opium war narrative, it's often more for domestic consumption, not necessarily a direct blueprint for foreign policy revenge. It might just oversimplify things.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this. We've got arguments for this revenge idea based on regulation gaps, history, geopolitics, and arguments against it based on lack of proof, China's own actions, market forces, and the limits of the analogy. What's the sort of bottom line analysis here? How credible is the revenge theory?
Well, I think you have to say the revenge mentality idea relies heavily on indirect evidence, on speculation. There's no smoking gun. It seems to get more traction in certain U.S. media and political circles, especially, when U.S.-China tensions are high.
Right. It fits a certain narrative, maybe?
It can. And focusing too much on it risks ignoring all those other complex factors. The U.S. domestic issues, the global economics of the drug trade, the real challenges of international law enforcement cooperation.
So it's a much messier picture than just China wants revenge.
Yeah.
What's the bigger takeaway for us and for you listening?
I think the broader view has to include those U.S. internal factors, addiction, healthcare system issues, had to include China's role as a major source of chemicals, likely due to its industry size and regulatory gaps, but probably not an active government conspiracy. And then there's the impact of geopolitics, where this whole issue gets caught up in the U.S.-China rivalry, which actually makes solving it harder.
So, concluding thought on this specific point.
I'd say while the historical parallels are interesting, maybe even provocative, interpreting China's role in the fentanyl crisis primarily as revenge for the Opium Wars, it just doesn't seem supported by enough hard evidence. It's likely an exaggeration fueled by current tensions. Really tackling this requires serious U.S.-China cooperation, law enforcement, intelligence, regulation, plus the U.S. addressing its own demand issues, and China tightening its chemical export controls. It's not simple.
Wow. Okay, so you see how what started as, a routine tariff update suddenly spirals into history, geopolitics, public health.
Yeah.
It's all connected. Is it just trade? Or are these historical echoes playing some part? Definitely gives you something to think about.
Absolutely. These things are never just about one thing, are they?
Never. Well, we are definitely going to keep watching this story develop. So make sure you subscribe to the deep dive. You don't want to miss future updates on this.
Yeah.
And hey, while you're doing that, maybe check out our good friend Micky's YouTube channel too. We're always happy to give Micky a shout out.
Yeah, definitely check out Micky's stuff. Always interesting.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Micky to Life. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it. We just wrapped up that really interesting discussion on the latest tariff moves.
Yeah, lots to unpack there.
Definitely. And now we're jumping straight into some other, pretty big stuff happening around the globe.
Always good to be here. It definitely feels like the global landscape is shifting pretty quickly these days.
You got that right. Feels like you blink and there's a whole new headline,
Definitely.
Speaking of headlines, we've got some pretty strong opinions coming out of Florida. So let's dive into what Senator Rick Scott has been saying about China.
Right. So Rick Scott, for those of you maybe not following U.S. politics super closely, he's a Republican senator, represents Florida, been there since 2019.
Okay.
And before that, he was governor of Florida for 8 years, generally known for, conservative views, economic policy, national security, foreign relations.
And he had that business background too, right?
Really,
CEO.
Exactly.
Yeah.
CEO of a major healthcare company, Columbia HCA.
Yeah.
So, yeah, comes from that world as well.
Okay, so definitely a guy with, let's say, some experience and some strong beliefs. And when it comes to China, it sounds like he's not exactly pulling punches.
That's a fair way to put it. Based on his public statements, especially things he posts online, he views what he calls communist China as, well, fundamentally opposed to the American way of life.
Fundamentally opposed?
Yeah. He sees them as a threat, basically across the board, to our economy, our national security, even our democratic values. He doesn't really mince words.
And it's not just talk, is it? I've read he's actually pushing for some pretty significant changes, like telling Americans to stop buying Chinese goods, really pushing Made in USA.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge part of it. He's a strong proponent of what's called economic decoupling.
Decoupling, right.
Think of it like trying to untangle our economies, so we're not so reliant, especially on China. He also wants to see much tougher action against Chinese companies that don't follow U.S. laws. Well, really pushing to enforce things like the Foreign Company Accountability Act. That's the one that basically says if foreign companies on U.S. stock exchanges don't comply with our auditing standards for, 3 years straight.
They could get kicked off.
Yeah, potentially delisted from the NYSE and NASDAQ. It's a serious measure.
Wow. Okay. That could have a massive impact. And it doesn't stop with economics, does it? I feel like I heard something about the opioid crisis, too.
Yes, absolutely. That's another really significant piece of his critique. He directly accuses China of intentionally sending fentanyl into the U.S.
Intentionally?
That's his claim, saying it's a major cause of the opioid epidemic, the tragic deaths we've seen. He frames it as a deliberate act harming Americans.
Yeah, that's a really serious accusation. And then there's the whole human rights aspect, Xinjiang.
Exactly. He's been very vocal about the situation there. Uses extremely strong terms like genocide to describe China's treatment of the Uyghur population. Calls China a communist regime practicing genocide. It's a severe condemnation, and it lines up with what, many human rights groups and some governments have been saying.
So it really sounds like, from his perspective, there's just no trust there at all, even on things like trade deals.
Pretty much. His position seems to be that China has a long history of not living up to its agreements, even the ones signed under Trump, during that first term.
Right.
And that they consistently ignore WTO rules. He's really skeptical of any deals China makes, suggesting they only come to the table because they're facing their own economic problems, not out of genuine cooperation.
So the underlying idea is any economic gains China makes just fuels what aggression,
expansion. That seems to be the core concern, yeah. He suggests China's growing economic power is directly funding its ambitions to become more dominant globally, and he sees this as sort of inherent to their system, their nature.
Okay, so we get what he's saying, but why such a tough stance? What's the motivation driving this?
Well, there are likely several factors, right? First, national security is clearly a big one for him. He sees China's rapid tech advancements, their economic clout, as a direct threat to the U.S. position globally.
Especially in key areas like tech and supply chains.
Exactly. So restricting investment in Chinese firms, viewing China as a major competitor geopolitically and ideologically, that's central to his thinking.
Makes sense from a, America first kind of perspective. And I imagine this resonates with his voters.
Absolutely. His stance aligns really well with concerns many conservative voters have about, economic competition from China, jobs, intellectual property theft, human rights abuses.
And public opinion has shifted generally, hasn't it?
Massively. It's really worth noting, public perception of China in the U.S. has become much more negative over the last decade or so. Since around 2020, the percentage of Americans seeing China as a top enemy has more than doubled. It went from maybe 22% up to 45%.
Wow. Okay, so tapping into that is definitely part of it.
For sure. And then there's the ideological piece. He sees the Chinese Communist Party's governance model as fundamentally opposed to American democratic values. It's almost like that ideological security dilemma idea, where each side sees the other's basic system as a threat.
Okay, so playing this forward, if his views gain more traction, more influence in Washington, what could that actually mean for U.S.-China relations?
Well, if these ideas become more dominant, you could definitely see a much stronger push towards that economic decoupling we talked about.
More tariffs. More restrictions.
Probably. More companies trying to shift supply chains out of China, which, could lead to higher costs for U.S. businesses and consumers, and China would almost certainly retaliate. Maybe restricting access to rare earths or other key materials.
And politically, things are already pretty tense.
Yeah, his kind of rhetoric calling China an enemy could definitely escalate geopolitical tensions further. The risk of confrontation over sensitive areas like Taiwan or the South China Sea might increase. It's interesting because some argue the current U.S. ambiguity on Taiwan can lead to miscalculation by China. But if the U.S. took a much harder line, like Scott might advocate, that could also provoke a really strong Chinese reaction. It's tricky.
And that ideological clash you mentioned.
His really strong condemnation of the CCP could just intensify the propaganda wars, right? Worsen public perceptions on both sides. Now, probably neither side wants a full-on Cold War replay, but that kind of language could definitely push things further in that direction.
Yeah. What about the impact here domestically? Could his views shape actual U.S. policy if he gains more power, say, in the Senate?
Oh, potentially, yeah. If he were in a leadership role, he could certainly push for more restrictive laws, tighter export controls, more screening of investments, limits on tech transfer.
But that could cut both ways, couldn't it?
That's the potential downside. While aimed at protecting U.S. innovation, it might also limit U.S. companies' access to the huge Chinese market or hinder international scientific collaboration. And unfortunately, there's always the concern that very strong anti-China rhetoric could fuel mistrust or even discrimination against Chinese Americans here at home.
So it kind of boils down to this view. China's untrustworthy, inherently aggressive, and doing business with them just empowers them.
That's a pretty good summary of his core argument, yeah. Fundamentally untrustworthy, driven by expansion. But, it's always worth considering if that's maybe an oversimplification of China's complex motives.
Right.
And just how practical is complete decoupling, given how intertwined our economies still are. Plus, history suggests demonizing a major power can really shut down communication channels, increasing risks.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. This no limits cooperation between China and Russia, that keeps coming up. It sounds pretty significant.
It really is. A very notable development. You had Xi Jinping visiting Russia recently around their Victory Day commemorations for World War II.
Right, I saw that.
And his meetings with Putin really hammered home this strengthening no-limit strategic partnership. They're very vocal about opposing what they call Western hegemony, and they reaffirmed their tough stance on Taiwan.
Which obviously raises concerns.
Absolutely. Big concerns internationally about Taiwan's security.
So Xi is pretty openly aligning with Russia against the U.S. and the West. Is that the takeaway?
That's the clear message, yeah.
Yeah.
They're actively working to strengthen this alliance. They met in the Kremlin, called each other ironclad friends.
Ironclad friends.
Yeah. Set goals to boost trade and investments significantly by 2030. Jointly criticized unilateralism, hegemony, and bullying. Pretty obviously aimed at the U.S. and allies. She even wrote an article in Russian media talking about upholding UN authority, protecting developing countries, promoting equal, inclusive economic globalization. And their joint statements are interesting. They're even trying to link historical narratives, connecting Ukraine to the WWII anti-fascist struggle.
Is it just talk, though? Or is there actual tangible support flowing to Russia?
Well, economically, definitely. China's become Russia's biggest trading partner since the Ukraine war started, buying lots of Russian energy, supplying high-tech components that Russia struggles to get elsewhere because of sanctions.
Right, the sanctions bypass.
Exactly. Militarily, it's murkier. China denies sending direct military aid. But there were reports of PLA special forces in Victory Day parade rehearsals in Moscow. And Ukraine accuses China of supplying war-related materials. So maybe not tanks and guns, but definitely economic support and potentially dual-use stuff.
And what's the bigger picture here? Why this alignment against the West? What's the driving ideology?
Well, she frames the West, especially the U.S., as the source of hegemonic bullying, criticizes sanctions, trade restrictions. He's positioning the China-Russia alliance as a counterweight.
Trying to rally others.
Yeah, kind of framing it as standing against neo-Nazism and fascist forces, trying to appeal to the global South, countries that might feel marginalized by the U.S.-led order. And this is happening, well, there are some strains in U.S. alliances and uncertainty about future U.S. policy towards Russia, especially with Trump potentially returning.
Okay, this all sounds pretty concerning for Taiwan. She's been very clear about reunification, right?
Absolutely. During that Russia visit, he reiterated, Taiwan is an inseparable part of China's territory, thanked Russia for supporting China's national reunification goal. And this comes alongside increased Chinese military activity around Taiwan.
Like those big exercises recently.
Exactly. The Straight Thunder 2025A exercises earlier this year involved all branches simulating blockades, precision strikes, widely seen as a direct response to Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te's speech where he called China an external hostile force.
And they're building new equipment too, landing craft.
Yeah, reports of new landing craft suggest they're working on the practical capabilities for an amphibious assault. Plus, you have those U.S. intelligence reports saying Xi told the PLA to be ready for a potential invasion by 2027.
So with Russia seemingly on board, does this mean even more diplomatic pressure on Taiwan? Isolation.
It certainly reinforces China's strategy of trying to isolate Taiwan internationally. Xi emphasizing ultimate reunification with Russia's backing sends that signal. President Lai is pushing back, calling on Europe to support Taiwan against this new authoritarian bloc.
Referring to China, Russia.
Clearly. But China's actions aim to squeeze Taiwan's international space. Taiwan's foreign ministry slammed the China-Russia statement as distorted rhetoric. And there's this linkage people keep drawing between Ukraine and Taiwan, the China-Russia alliance potentially seeing Taiwan as the next front.
So what does this all mean for the U.S.-China relationship, which is already pretty strained, and for stability there in the Strait?
Well, you're likely looking at increased U.S.-China friction. Xi clearly sees the U.S. as the main obstacle and is using the Russia partnership to challenge that U.S.-led order. We already talked about trade tension.
Right, tariffs.
Yeah, leading China to accuse the U.S. of extortion. The U.S. Defense Secretary vows to counter China's aggression, but then you have potential shifts in U.S. policy under a different administration, which could, create uncertainty for allies.
So the risk of actual conflict, is it going up?
Unfortunately, that seems to be the direction. China's military drills, the alignment with Russia, it can be seen as testing U.S. red lines, especially with potential U.S. policy shifts. It creates a dangerous dynamic where miscalculation on either side could lead to escalation.
A real security dilemma.
Exactly. Increased U.S. and allied support for Taiwan could be prompted by China's actions, but that could also trigger a stronger Chinese response.
How are other countries reacting? Like the EU?
The EU is emphasizing maintaining the status quo, opposing unilateral force. But their main focus seems to be economic de-risking from China, rather than military confrontation.
Yeah.
And Taiwan itself.
Its international space is pressured, definitely. But its democracy and vital role in semiconductors give it significant Western support. President Lai's firm stance might provoke Beijing, but it also raises Taiwan's international visibility.
And this all seems to circle back in a way to Rick Scott's hawkish stance, doesn't it? His views kind of fit this escalating picture.
They really do. His tough stance aligns with this current dynamic. It could potentially give him more clout in Congress to push for more sanctions, more decoupling, more military aid to Taiwan, maybe more anti-China messaging.
Which carries its own risks, as we said.
Right. The risk of increasing miscalculation, especially if you factor in potential changes in U.S. policy towards Russia.
So looking ahead, what are the key risks, the outlook?
Short term, probably continued Chinese probing, testing U.S. commitment to Taiwan, maybe some weakening of allied confidence if U.S. policy seems uncertain. Long term, China's military modernization aiming for 2027 is a major challenge.
Making U.S. policy on Taiwan even more critical. The U.S. probably needs to figure out a clearer, more consistent approach, and this China-Russia cooperation really could reshape global geopolitics. Better U.S.-China crisis communication seems vital in getting the broader international community involved in pushing for non-military solutions.
Okay, one more piece of this, a very complex puzzle. China accusing Taiwan of provocation and specifically framing President Lai Ching-te as a warmonger. What's that about?
Yes. That's classic strategic propaganda, really. China is trying to construct a narrative, a story, that justifies its own actions towards Taiwan.
To make themselves look like the reasonable one.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Shift the blame for any tensions onto Taipei, frame any potential future actions they might take as just a forced response to Taiwan's supposed bad behavior.
And this plays domestically, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial for domestic propaganda. Helps rally national support, portrays Taiwan as colluding with external forces, meaning the U.S. pursuing Taiwan independence. And internationally, it's an attempt to weaken support for Taiwan, to win the public opinion battle.
So what kind of language are they using? How are they painting President Lai?
They use some very specific loaded terms. You hear stubborn separatist a lot, accusing him of trying to split the country, violating the one China principle.
So his emphasis on Taiwan's sovereignty is framed as the provocation.
Exactly. They say that's what leads to conflict. They also call him a war maker, a crisis instigator, accuse him of colluding with external forces, buying U.S. arms, engaging in diplomacy specifically to create a crisis.
Wow. War maker.
Yeah. And sometimes sinner who destroys peace, emphasizing his Taiwan independence rhetoric, undermines their idea of peaceful reunification, portraying him as the obstacle to China's national rejuvenation.
Any other labels?
Puppet of external forces is another one, suggesting he's just doing the bidding of the U.S. and the West, inviting wolves into the house, threatening regional stability.
So it's really about controlling the narrative.
Precisely. And the tactics include things like selectively quoting lies, stronger statements, maybe ignoring parts where he calls for peace or dialogue.
Taking things out of context.
Could be. And timing their military intimidation to coincide with this rhetoric, claiming the exercises are just responses to Taiwan independence provocation. Plus, using their global media arms, like CGTN, and diplomatic channels to push this narrative worldwide.
It sounds like a pretty deliberate, multi-pronged strategy.
It really is, aimed at shifting responsibility, justifying their policies, gaining support. But, like we talked about with Scott's rhetoric, this kind of aggressive messaging can also backfire. It can escalate tensions further, maybe damage China's own international image in the long run.
Well, this has been a real deep dive into some incredibly complex and, frankly, interconnected issues. We've covered Rick Scott's really critical view of China.
Yeah, the decoupling push, the accusation.
Right. Then the growing China-Russia no-limits cooperation and what that means, especially for Taiwan's security.
And the military exercises, the diplomatic pressure.
And finally, China's own efforts to paint Taiwan and President Lai as the source of the problem through propaganda. It all paints a picture of a very delicate global situation, potentially unstable.
Absolutely. And we didn't even get deeply into it, but Taiwan's huge role in the global economy, semiconductors especially, and its position as a democracy just underlines why its security matters to everyone. Any conflict there would ripple outwards significantly.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive into some pretty significant global issues.
Definitely gives you a lot to think about, doesn't it?
For sure. So what does all this mean for how we, see the world around us? Maybe it's time we all paid a bit more attention to where the stuff we buy actually comes from.
Or maybe dig a little deeper into why certain countries are aligning the way they are.
Yeah, and it really makes you wonder, with all these big players and moving pieces, what's that one unexpected thing, that one wild card that could really change the whole game?
A question to ponder.
All right, and that is all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Thanks for digging into it with me.
Always great to talk it through. And to all of you listening, if you found this discussion interesting or helpful, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We've got lots more ground to cover.
And hey, while you're at it, check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel too. We're always promoting.
Always promoting. Got to support friends. But seriously, thanks for tuning in.
Until next time.